Good afternoon. You will find out that I'll send you an email tomorrow that I'm telecasting this on Thursday afternoon on the 5th of June. I will be out of town next week, and the following week I will do the regular week next week, which would be chapters 12 and 13 on Monday, the the 9th. This will be posted for you to review, and I will send a note about that. I again had technical problems, as you come to find out through this period of time. I'm still learning this process. I hope I can get it down before we get to the end of the session. I like to say that I'm semi-trainable, and I think probably just a second, I think the accent is on semi. So for this particular session, which will be broadcast, as I said, for you whenever you want to access it, it'll be uploaded tomorrow. But this is for week 7. Chapters 14 and 15, Leadership Challenges and Organizational Change. For chapter 14, I notice the subtitle, You Can't Do It Alone. So let's move on. We hope to answer these questions as we go through tonight. What is moral leadership? What is shared leadership? And how do you lead across cultures, which is very interesting. And then finally, how do you lead organizational change? Always a contentious issue. So the first thing we ask here tonight is, what is authentic leadership? What it says here, to cut to the chase, is being true to yourself. Notice it says owning your experiences. Well, yeah, you don't want anybody else to own those. And so it's also, as far as I'm concerned, walking the talk and talking the walk. You can't do this any way other than that. It's just very important that you have complete ownership of this thing. And when you do, this comes across. People see you as real and personal, and realize that they're not getting something that's made up. There's no polished thing here. We're not trying to sell anything other than what you see. What you see is what you get. Now, this particular slide talks about how a leader's personality can influence his or her followers. And we talk here now next about self-efficacy. Remember, we talked about this early on, and this is just the thought by an individual that he or she can visualize a task and realize that they're going to be successful in completing that task. This thing of self-efficacy comes from Albert Bandura, who is a professor at Stanford. I think he's still there. He did this, as the paper says, the seminal work about this in 1977. So if you do some quick math, that's 37 years ago. So there is a possibility Dr. Bandura is not still there. But what he says is, and I want to pass this on to you, people with strong sense of self-efficacy view challenging problems as tasks to be mastered. They develop deeper interests in the activities in which they participate. I think that's pretty easy to understand. Form a stronger sense of commitment to both their interests and their activities, and to recover quickly from setbacks and disappointments. So that's ability to bounce back, to rebound, however you want to say that. People, and I think we need to talk about this, people who do not have a strong sense of self-efficacy avoid challenging tasks, believe that difficult tasks and situations are beyond their capabilities, Focus on personal failings and negative outcomes. Notice that. Personal failings and negative outcomes. You know, if you think you're not going to succeed, chances are you won't, because you've already set yourself up for failure. And last, quickly lose confidence in personal abilities. Now, I certainly don't want to argue with Dr. Bandura. He has a lot more cachet than I do, but I would argue with that they wouldn't quickly lose confidence. I would say they never had it. So I just giving you a little bit different than what Dr. Bandura says. You know, he's the expert here. He's the guy that came up with this theory. So you know, follow what he has to say. But I just think we can look at that a little bit differently. By the way, I forgot to blow these up, so I'll do that here with our next slide. Now here we have two thought processes, or two things that we think about all the time. This thing with hope means that we look at things as there's more than one way that we can achieve something, and there's a different pathway. So if we're not stuck right here. We think that we can get to the end state we want to be in, and we're going to explore every course that we can to make sure we can get there, because we believe, we hope, maybe that's a better way of saying it, that we're going to succeed. And resiliency just goes back to that rebound thing we talked about before. It's the capacity to keep on going when you don't think you can go any further. You reach a stopping point, yet you still have this energy to move forward. Now, we're going to talk next about spiritual leadership. And yeah, those, by the way, let's go back here. These are two aspects of moral leadership, or two aspects that we see in moral leadership. Now we're going to move into spiritual leadership. And I want to be really clear here that this type of leadership comes from within. I don't think, and again, this is my interpretation, I don't think that spiritual leadership can be taught. I think you can take people to that to the precipice, and they are the ones that have to decide to immerse themselves to go into it. I think you can set the parameters. I think you can set the things up, and people can do that, but I don't think you can actually teach that. Again, I say it comes from within. It's based on deep-seated internal values and attitudes. What I want to say to you here, and the textbook points this out, and I'm not doing it because the textbook points this out, but I think we can all see this. Do not confuse this with being religious. Now, you can be religious and be spiritual, but you can be spiritual and not religious, and you can be religious and not spiritual. The Dalai Lama is a spiritual person, and yet, as far as I know, he doesn't have any particular religion that, like we like to think of, we in the Western world. And there are other people who are into that Eastern orientation, etc., that gets them in this spirituality. So please don't confuse it with being religious. That does not mean to say that religious people are not spiritual and vice versa. But you know, simply going to a place of worship every week does not necessarily make you spiritual. That doesn't make you a bad person either. It just doesn't necessarily make you spiritual. Some people, it takes something from within to get that, and all of us don't have that. You know, and I'm not when I'm talking here, I'm not using myself as an example of spirituality. I'm just saying that there are people who really have a little problem with to do this. Now, the causal model of spirituality, as we see on this slide, is based on altruism, unselfish behavior. The vision is where do we go and where do we want to go? Hope, effort, able to go the distance. That's all part of this. Now, the next thing we come to is something from John Greenleaf. John Greenleaf was the founder of the servant leadership movement. That's the term that I want to use. It's a very powerful type thing. What he simply says is, I'm going to leave this up here for you to read for yourselves. What he simply says is this: you can't be a leader unless you're willing to serve first. And I like to put that in just a little bit different terms here, if you don't mind. You can't lead unless you can put yourself in your followers' shoes. You have to know who your followers are to be able to lead. And you can't lead without followers. So this is something that's very important. Now you can learn about Greenleaf if you want to type in, go to a search engine and type in servant leadership or type in Robert Greenleaf. But I would like to give you his 10 principles of servant leadership. The first is listening. Servant leaders must reinforce these important skills by making a deep commitment to listening intently to others. Well, that goes back to what we learned in communication. Empathy. People need to be accepted and recognized for their special and unique spirit. Healing. One of the great strengths of servant leadership is the potential to heal oneself and others. Awareness. That general awareness is what he's talking about here, and especially self-awareness strengths of the servant leader, or excuse me, strengthens the servant leader. Persuasion. Servant leaders rely on persuasion rather than positional authority in making decisions. Isn't that interesting? Servant leaders seek to convince others by rational persuasion. Conceptualization. The ability to look at a problem or an organization, as the case may be, from a conceptualized perspective means that one must think beyond day-to-day realities. Foresight. I don't think we have to talk about that. It's something we need here. Stewardship. This talks about CEOs, staff, directors, and trustees all play significant roles in holding their institutions in trust for the good of society. Commitment to the growth of people. As such, servant leaders are deeply committed to a personal, professional, and spiritual growth of each and every individual within their organization. Boy, that's some statement. When you think of some organizations we have in the United States, and there are other ones throughout the world that have thousands of people working for them. And finally, building community. Servant leaders seek to identify a means for building community among those who work within a given institution. I think those are very profound pieces of information, and I strongly suggest that you look up some information on Greenleaf and these other things, because it'll give you more than what we talked about here. And those 10 principles go along with this particular slide. We talked about this before, the community, vision, desire, again, to serve first. Very, very, very important thing. This particular slide just directs you to leadership values, gives you a website quick survey based on Mick Yates. You can do this if you want, not something that you have to do, but notice if you decide to take that, you will get feedback very, very quickly. Now we're going to walk into having some, if you will, some compare and contrast from these leadership styles, but we're going to talk about transformational leadership first. This is somebody who emphasizes, or a transformational leader is someone who emphasizes vision, values, etc. And this person's talking for the most part about radical change. And they try to connect with their followers through the intellect. So they want to talk to them based upon how we understand things and on how we can move these concepts that we're talking about forward. This slide we come to next, I'm going to blow this up just a little bit more if I can, and then you can see this in figure 14.2 in the text. This gives us each of these: authentic leadership, spiritual leadership, and transformational leadership, some similarities with ethical leadership, and then differences from it. Now, you can read these in the book. I don't need to read these to you, but I think there's some things we ought to look at these similarities: integrity and role modeling, concern for others, in all three. And I prefer to focus on the commonalities as opposed to the differences. But one thing that's mentioned here is that ethical leaders are concerned about moral management, and they're concerned about probably more the here and now. So that tends to be a little more transactional than it is transformational. You know, transactional looks at the day-to-day. By the way, we're going to talk about transactional, or we will talk about, hopefully you'll get the transactional before you get here in chapter 13. But we can't dismiss one from the other. We like to think, oh boy, transformational, best things since sliced bread and safety pin, a few other things, and we're gonna neglect this transactional. No, you can't do that. You need to have both of these. You want your leader to be transformational for the most part, but he or she has to have the transactional people there to make things go and stay in place that need to stay in place, while he or she's looking at this big picture and trying to move us forward. Shared leadership is exactly what it says. I can't change that any. I can't fix it any. We see this in teams, and I think it's something that we I shouldn't say we know it and we see it. That I started to say that, and that's not correct. But we're going to see this in self-directed teams. Remember that they're responsible for their own destiny, if you will. They do all these things, and so they're going to do these things, and they're going to take each individual within that team, and he or she that is good in a particular area, that's what they're going to do, and they're going to share that, and it's going to come out as a team thing, not as an individual type thing, if you will. Now here's the conditions for successful team performance. You know, we've talked about these things in the past, and we really don't need to talk about them a whole lot here. I don't think so, but there are some things that are important. Resources. If a team does not have the resources it needs, no matter how good each individual team member is, they're not going to be successful. It's simple as that. You know, you can't make you can't make a silk purse out of a sow's ear, is the old adage. And so that's what we're saying here. You have to have. There has to be motivation. And motivation should be self-motivation, should be motivation within the team to move things forward, and there has to be support. Support obviously comes somewhat in the form of adequate resources, but you need the support from other people. You know, oftentimes the you know, I don't like to say oftentimes, I just did it. Often the team leader works as a facilitator, and he or she would be helping to give the support, etc. But then you need something else in there. And then the final thing, we talked about this again before too in chapter 8, an emphasis on continuous improvement. And so that's very, very important. And the last part of that slide talks about being able, that last bullet, excuse me, talks about being able to adapt. And that's the mark of anybody who is successful, whether that person's working in a team and it's a team itself, or he or she's working alone. You have to be able to adapt. Things just aren't always static. Now, these are what the slide calls self-leadership activities. And, I don't think, again, these take a lot of understanding. I think, everybody in this class is sitting someplace throughout the day at a workstation or something else if they prefer to call it that, and they know what we need to be. You have to be a self-starter. You have to have an ability to do things and see them and act upon. You have to be able to receive inner satisfaction from your achievements. Hey, I did a good job here, and I really like. I'm satisfied about that. I can remember when I was in the Army many years ago. I had to write. We always used to get dinged by our inspectors general on not having adequate standard operating procedures and not addressing things. And I spent a good deal of time, a couple of months, writing our standard operating procedures. And I knew that I did a good job. It was nice to hear the inspector say that he thought was one of the better ones he'd ever seen. Of course, he said, you don't need to have secure your weapons in 3 different places, which was something I had missed. But regardless, I knew I'd done a good job. I took satisfaction out of it, and we were moving forward with things we hadn't moved forward for before. Nice to hear that, but I didn't really need to hear that. And then we need to be able to think through what we're doing. We need to be able to see the task from beginning to end, step by step, if you wish, or maybe you don't work step by step. You can conceptualize it. This is what I need to do. This is the end state, and here's how I'm going to get there. Now, this next slide gets us into an area that is very interesting, and I'm not going to tell you that I have a lot of experience here. Yeah, I've worked with people to some extent when I was in the Army with people, my peers in other armies outside the United States, but my experience there is not extensive. But what this is talking about is looks at commonalities and what is effective across cultures, and then and what works, what seems to work, what doesn't seem to work, etc. Now I'm going to take you to the next slide here, which is the globe. Notice here what it says. It's a theoretical model, so it's not something that's been proven. We're still working on a theory, and it makes us the bottom slide says a number of assumptions, and we can see what the forces here: society, cultures, norms and practices, leader behaviors, attitudes, etc., and how they go, and whether or not we have something that's culturally accepted. Okay, and then finally come down to the fact of leader acceptance and then leader effectiveness. So I'd like to look at some of these factors that come up here, and we can see them on the next slide. By the way, you can find these in the text just as well. I don't want to talk to each one of these, but I do want to talk to and mention what I consider to be the important things here. We're talking about vision. That doesn't change across the board. We're talking about having a people focus. I would submit to you that no leader is effective if he or she does not have concern for the for their followers. It just is not going to happen. And that's what this thing talks about, being humane oriented. And then the last thing I want to talk about is what is known there, as shown on the slide, as participative. That's what we call democratic. Now, you know, we talk about democracy, and we've had some presidents that talk about taking democracy to other countries. I think in some cases we make a mistake when we say that, because people have a certain perception of what democracy is. And democracy is very messy, by the way. I think all you have to do is look and see how our Congress acts or doesn't act, et cetera, and how the Congress and the administration get along. And by the way, I'm not thinking necessarily of current events. I'm thinking about events that I've seen over a period of years, and hopefully you've seen over a period of your years. I realize some of us are not as old as others, but each of us should have some kind of experience that we've seen. But participative democracy means people have the ability or the chance to participate in the decision-making process, in the leadership process, and things of that nature. And so it is considering the needs of your individuals and getting them to participate in the process. It's democratic. Now, this next slide talks about the cultural dimensions that are associated here. And, you know, what we're talking here about is different cultures. We've been through some of these terms before: power distance, collectivism. Egalitarianism simply means we're going to treat people the same regardless of gender. We're not going to pay attention to what they are. Of course, we know that in some cultures, women are second-class citizens, and they remain that way regardless. For instance, Japanese women, I'm talking about in Japan, are not held at the same level of I'm going to use the term respect. That's the word I want to use. Excuse me, not reverence, respect. Even though the Meiji Code of 1851 said that women have equal standing to men, women are still beneath men. And I read it when I was in the postgraduate school at Virginia Tech. I was taking a cultural anthropology course, and of course, we had 6 books that we had to read, and we had to make some comparison and contrast in these books. And we read them in series of 3, because there was a commonality to each of the 3 books you read. The first half of the semester, if you will, and the second 3 books you read in the second half of the semester. And one of the books we read was about a second or third Japanese American who went back to Japan and lived with a family and worked in a candy factory. And she said that every one of the artisans, those people who did the decorations for the candy, et cetera, and the managers, every one of those people were men. There were no women that held any of those positions. And so it was very foreign to her, but it was very interesting to read this. Now, moving on a little bit with the globe. These are the key aspects that come up from the globe thought process, if you will. What we have here that we have to think about is that the leader must match, or must be aware of, and make sure he or she does, acceptable behavior. And notice here that down at the bottom we have terms like integrity and team-oriented are desirable leadership traits or dimensions, it says here, across most cultures. I think that's very interesting to think about, because the United States, Australia, probably Canada to some extent, and some other English-speaking countries, or at least have great foundation on English behavior and values, etc., are individualists. That's what we are. That's what this country is based on. We're based on being individuals. And there's too many examples that we have in our culture and in our stories and myths that we've talked about over a period of years to talk about individuals. So it's interesting to see that those are desirable leadership dimensions across this entire spectrum. And by the way, there are a couple of slides, a couple of figures in the textbook that I suggest that you look at that shows how these countries do, and they group them in geographic regions. Now we come to a very, very important issue for all leaders, but one that is challenging to everyone, and that's change leadership. This is something that is moving an organization, I'm speaking of organizations here, beyond the status quo. It's taking them someplace they have not been before, and it is going to cause pain. Not physical pain, but it's going to cause pain. It's going to cause angst. It's going to cause a measure of uncomfortableness. Very, very difficult to do. Notice here it talks about mastering change while creating a satisfying, healthy, and effective workplace. And I wanted to read those to you because it's very important to get those in our mind to understand that while change is necessary, we cannot forget that other. So if we're going to be change leaders or change agents, we can't forget those comfort things. And if we do, we're going to have a lot of problems. Now, the reason this is very important is because no one, I don't care who they are or who he or she is, nobody I know likes change. And especially if you're not the one doing it, we're creatures of comfort. We're used to doing what we're doing. So it's very important that the person in charge of the change keeps these things in mind. There's a balance that has to be struck. A couple of things we need to think about here is context. That is all the things that need to be measured and must be measured. And notice that we're talking about opportunities and things that we have to be concerned about. We have to know that there are not necessarily roadblocks, but road bumps. There may be some barriers that we have to go underneath, over top, around, whatever. But that's what we're talking about here. And of course, notice also it talks about behavior as well as relationship variables. Now, there are different types of context for leadership action. They talk here about stability. We know what that is. By the way, there's a slide coming. There's a figure coming up, and we'll get to that. We talk about stability. We talk about crisis because we've learned before that when we have a crisis, if we don't act on a crisis very quickly, we're risking long-term survival. Dynamic equilibrium. We have program changes here with shifting priorities. And the near edge of chaos, we're between order and disaster. And we have to make sure that we know that, and we can bridge that gap. Now, this is the figure that I talked about, figure 14.5 in your text. Gives the context, desire leadership, and then how to measure success. I don't want to go. Let's see if we can get this all on here at one time. I don't. No, well, I had it. It's okay. So we don't need to go through all this thing all at one time. we do need to see if we're talking about stability. We talk about crisis. You know, that's something we really have to be careful about because we don't act upon as quickly. We're going to have a lot of problems. Near edge of chaos. Remember, we're between stability and lookout. So notice we need to do that. So what kind of leadership do we need in each of these? Notice the first one we're talking about supportive leadership. We go into this crisis. You have to have transformational or charismatic leadership, because if you don't have that, if you don't have this person who has a vision to get you beyond this, we're going to be a lot of problems. Here we talk about dynamic equilibrium. We're talking about stressing ethical leadership. And the near edge of chaos talks about stressing diversification. And then how we measure these things. Performance goals, adjusting to crisis, return to normalcy, etc. Patterning attention. This is simply separating the important from what is not. We talked about this before in different contexts and in different ways. We have to know what's important. We have to act what's unimportant. And the other things we don't need to worry about. That's part of the 80-20 rule, which I'm going to bring up in the next hour, but that applies here just as well. Now, transformational change, we have two kinds of change that we're going to talk about here. We have transformational change and incremental change. And a lot of times we tend to think that one is better than the other because transformational change is something big, and boy, we can see this, and everybody stands up and takes notice, etc. But you know, we can't always have that. So think of transformational change as being huge, taking us from here we are here today to someplace we had not expected to be. Incremental change, to me, the epitome of the Japanese, constant improvement. We want to continually improve what we're doing. And this can be in our operations. It can be making product better. It can be a lot of things. And in many cases, it gives us a chance to continue to survive. Now, we know what this is. We talked about this back in chapter 9. We called it non-program change and something different. But, you know, here we have unplanned change. We know exactly what that is. It's just nobody's thought about it. And something we're going to have to do that maybe it got forced on us. And we're just going to have to sit down and take care of it. So that's something we need to think about. It's not something we can plan for. We have to be ready to adapt to it when it comes along. And I think that's the key word, is adaptation. Then, excuse me, I just lost my notes here. Back. And then, of course, we have the plan change, and then the performance gap represents, and this is important to make sure we get this in our minds, so I want to read this to you. It represents problems to be solved or opportunities to be explored. Okay, so we need to think about that. Now, this next slide just gives us a number of things. This is, by the way, this is put to 14.6 in your text. You see that at the bottom of page 337. And these are just targets for change. You know, there's a whole bunch of them. We don't need to look at each and every one of these things. But, you know, strategies, one we need to think about. Strategies should be constantly reviewed, updated, refined, whatever it happens to be, based upon how we find, what kind of environment we find ourselves in. It's not something that should be static. And then of course we have things like technology. I mean, technology changes practically by the minute. And so it's something that companies need to stay up with. They cannot afford to be left behind in technological changes. And I'm only talking here about technology and providing information, maybe being able to do things for you, et cetera. So you got to stay abreast of that. And you have to make sure that you are ready to move forward when you need to. Now we're going to talk about change strategies. This particular slide talks with power change strategies. And this power change is really something that just boils down to authority. I have the authority to make this change happen, and I'm going to do it because I have the authority. In my position, we're going to go, and it rests with me. I'm going to go forward. And it could be a thought of damn the torpedoes full speed ahead, as Admiral Dewey said. Wait a minute, it wasn't Dewey. I think somebody else. Don't keep me away from that. I might be wrong about Dewey. It might have been somebody else. But yeah, I mean, we have the ability here. We're in charge. We can exert our authority and our position, power, etc. We're just going to do it. Hadn't thought about it, but we're using this to, in a way, get people to do the things we want them to do. Now, this comes to the next strategy that is really not a very good one. And this goes back to the authority. And we're forcing people to do something. We may offer some inducements, but they know they don't get the inducement if they don't do this. And it could be, as it says, punishments or whatever. But, my note here says, and I'm going to repeat this, and I think we may even talk about it in chapter 15, don't do it. You're going to get short-term buy-in because you're in charge and you have this hook, if you will, or maybe stick and carrot is a better way to get compliance. It's going to be short-lived, and it isn't going to be worth it. Then we want to talk about another one, which is rational persuasion. And here we're using facts and figures. We may bring in experts, etc., and we're appealing to someone, to our followers, we're appealing to their intellect, and we're giving them a story based on facts and figures and showing how this change is going to improve the way we're doing things. And why would any rational person not want to go along with this? Now, we're not going to say that, but that's how we're doing this. If we give you the facts and the figures, we're bringing some expert who can show, that he or she's done this and it's going to work, and we're going to go forward. Then that's what we're doing. We're appealing to reason and we're appealing to logic. And if they follow what we're laying out, it is logical argument. I have to use that word argument, but we're not going to have a problem. Then we have what's known as shared power. And here we're actually going out and getting the people who are going to be affected by the change and get them into the planning process to make them key operatives in this change so they can see what's going to happen. They're on the ground floor, and they're helping move it along, and they're in a leadership position in moving this change along. So we've got a lot of buy-in here. We've got people that now have ownership, and it's going to help move this process forward. Well, we've talked about all the good things about change. Of course, don't forget I don't like forced coercion, but we have this bugaboo that we talked about here about resistance to change, and a lot of times it doesn't even have any rational reason for it. And I'm against this. I don't like it. We always done it the other way, and it works. Why do I have to change? And slide talks everything about being unwilling, etc. And sometimes it's just being a stick in the mud. Saying, I'm not going to do it. I don't want to do it. I'm going to take my bat and ball, go home. And it's a problem because you're not even talking to somebody who's rational. So, we have to realize that that's going to happen. And we're going to have some problems along the way. Now, here's some reasons. Don't like to change. Talked about it. We've done this before. Why make a change? We've been satisfied here for 153 years. We don't like the strategy to implement the change, or perhaps even worse, we don't like the person who's going to lead the change, a change agent. A lot of times there's no rational thought to support any of these positions. It just is because we can't figure it out, so we have to work on it. Now, here's what we can do. And by the way, the next slide shows these particular approaches. You can see this in figure 14.8 on the top of page 341. Education and communication is great in a way. You want to communicate with people. You want to educate them as much as possible. It does help because people now understand what you want to do, but it's time consuming. So you have to understand that you may not have the time to do that. Participation and involvement, it goes back to what we talked about before in the shared power thing. You're getting people buy-in, so you can get their feeling about this, and they're committed to this, etc. But again, we're talking about something that's time consuming. Facilitation and support, the same way. I think you may have some differences in approach, etc. And again, you have to understand that this is something that's going to take time. Negotiation and agreement, remember that this can possibly be expensive, can cause, because you're negotiating maybe with a constituency and you feel like you have to make some agreement here that may cost some money, not necessarily increased wages, etc. And so you set a bar, and now you have other constituencies that want that bar set for them. So now you have an amount of money that you're that you have to commit, or resources that you don't necessarily want to commit, and maybe you can't commit them anyway. So you got a problem here. Just be careful with it. It can work because if you're negotiating, remember we go back to chapter 10. If you get negotiation and it works well, then you get more buy-in. So it may be good to do. Manipulation and co-optation. I'm just telling you, don't do that. It's not a good idea because you're not being at the forefront. Can cause problems in a people's sense that they're being manipulated. They're going to resist anything you try to do or anything that you want to do. And then finally, explicit and implicit coercion. Explicit, we know what that is. Everybody sees it as open and above board. And we're, this is the real stick and carrot. You can actually see the stick and carrot, as opposed to implicit, where it's there, you know about it because it's talked about. Here's what we're going to do for you if you do this, and here's what's going to happen to you. Bang, bang, bang on the head if you don't do it. Even though you have not overtly said that, explicitly said it, everybody understands what you're trying to do here. Don't do that. It isn't going to work. And the only thing that's going to happen here is that people are going to get aggravated and are going to say, I'm not going to use the word, I'm going to use the term, get me out of here. I don't want anything to do with this. You're treating me like something other than a human. Or like somebody, I don't think I have any sense. So don't do it. Not a good idea. Skip it, forget it, move on to something else. Well, at 5:18 here, I see it. It brings us to the end of chapter 14. I'm going to take a few minutes break here, and then I'll come back and discuss chapter 15 with you. So give me just a few minutes. We'll get the slides up here, and we'll get back to it, and we'll get into chapter 15. Thank you. Okay, I took just a few seconds longer than I thought of what we're going to now get into chapter 15, organization, culture, and innovation. So here's what we hope to be able to answer as we go through this next 40 or 50 minutes. What is organizational culture? How do you understand an organization's culture? That should read, as far as I'm concerned. What is innovation, and why is it important? And then finally, how to manage organization culture and innovation. Organization culture. I think that we can simply say put it all things that make us us. And we learned some about this in chapter 4. Organization culture is concerned about two things: external adaptation and internal integration. So here we're using a scorecard, if you will, to measure goal achievement, knowing how to get there and developing ways to understand and learn from successes and failures. Remember, we do learn from failure. We don't always like to think that we do, but we do learn from failure. And it's very important that we do that. So what's important about internal adaptation? External adaptation. What the slide says, at least as far as I'm concerned, that we must work on what's important. Now, this is where I was talking about in the last hour about the 80-20 rule. Some people have even refined that to say it's the 90-10 rule. And that is, we get 80% of our return on 20% of the things that we do. The other 80%, we get 20% on it. What we must learn is not to spend more time on the tasks that give us little return or little bang for our buck, if you prefer, than what we do. The Army years ago had an old training film, and I won't go through the whole process, but James Whitmore, a famous actor, did a thing about you get things that come to you every day that are have three priorities. There are A things, which means you should act on them. There are B things, or there are C things. These C things mean there are things that you could put away and think about. And the B things, you want to move B to either A or C. And so you want to work on the A things because they're the ones that are going to give you the best return. The C things you can forget. Or you can put them away and not worry about them. Now, he said, Whitmore, put the C things in the bottom desk drawer. If somebody asks for them in 6 months, throw them out. And I want to tell you that I've actually practiced that. I don't think I practice as much today as I did when I was in the Army. But I can tell you that there were things that weren't asked for, and I didn't do anything with them. Throw them out. Don't need them. We need to make sure we know what's important, what's not. Measure what we have done, and the last should not be. Notice they're creating explanations for not meeting goals. We don't want to think of that as failure. Rather, we want to show what we've learned. How did we learn in this process? And also let's take that away from being failure and turn that around into a learning opportunity that shows us we don't need to do this again because we've already learned. Don't do that. Now, these are the external adaptation questions that we should ask. And it's important to know that. What are we talking about? Success, Uh, you know, what are we supposed to do? What is our real mission? What is it we need to do to get there? How we're going to measure what we've done to show us what we do. So you ought to have some way to measure things that you have done. How do we tell our story? And notice it talks down here about telling people how good we are. And I must tell you, as a personal point, that's not something I'm ever comfortable with. I don't think you go around tooting your own horn, but you can do certain things to show what you have done and how the success has been achieved without bragging. And you need to do that. It's just simple. Finally, how do we know when we're getting no more return on what we're doing? When it's time to either fish or cut bait, we have to know those. We have to know those decision points, and we have to do that because we cannot get into things. And remember, we talked about in the past escalating commitment. We can't continue to doing that. It doesn't work. We keep doing things and doing things and doing things simply because. No, let's get out. Let's go on to something else. Let's go to something that's going to make it darn. We can't continue doing those kinds of things. Now, this is the other topic that we talked about, this internal integration. And again, it's kind of, talking about our collective, or talking about the collective or greater good, things of this nature, and how do we get along, how do we create relationships, how do we keep this machine that we have, what we call an organization, at one side oiled so that it continues doing what it's supposed to doing, but at the same time we have some glue here, some adhesive that keeps us together. There are two very important things, and we can't neglect one because of the other. Now, this is something that I want to pass out here to you. This is asking you to reflect on your current position or previous position about the orientation that you received when the first day you reported for the job. It asked you what kind it was. Was it formal? Did you sit down in an office and they give you all the paperwork, et cetera, and had you fill out the insurance forms, et cetera. They gave you some information about company policies, rules, and procedures, maybe an employee manual, et cetera. Were you taken to your department? I always like to think there's two ways of orienting an employee, and I think they're both equally important. First is a formal piece that talks about the rules and policies and procedures and getting an employee handbook and things like that, and filling out the required paperwork. Those things are all important. But then this other piece where somebody from your department comes down and gets you and takes you back to the department, shows you around the department, your workstation, et cetera. That's probably formal too, but some of it can be informal. Really very, very, very important. And it talks about how you met your teammates, et cetera. This is a critical thing because during orientation, if the orientation program fails to meet the expectations of the employee, the new employee, his or her chances of leaving before you want them to leave is high. Now, we're going to ask here, what is organization culture? And notice the things that we're talking about here. You can read this slide, but we're talking about relationships. We're talking about understanding the rules, policies, and procedures of the organization. Again, we're talking about the oil that keeps us moving, or the grease maybe is a better way to say that, but yet some kind of adhesive that holds us together. This is very important. We're talking about communication, relationships, getting along, things of that nature. Very, very, very important things that we need to do. So that's part of the organization culture, and we can't diminish that. These are notice the internal integration questions that are asked, and these again are very, very important. Give me a second. Who are we? And what makes us different from any other organization or from our competitors? How do we look at the outside? Do we look at the outside as something to be conquered? Or do we look at the outside as a challenge? Or do we look at the outside as being a try to build relationships? Who belongs, who doesn't? Again, this allocation of responsibility, of resources, power, authority, etc. Do we have good ways of talking to each other? And we do that in different ways, different aspects, different relationships. What makes us friendly? Again, this is the relationship part. Who's with us? Who's against us? Very interesting thing. We need to talk about those things. Now, this next slide talks about subculture, and I want to point out to you that the definition given in the margin on page 350 is not correct. You want to look inside the subculture and the body of the text. That gives you the correct definition. Subcultures are people that are not at variance with the organization. Their values, etc., are pretty much in sync. But they're a subculture, and we recognize it as a subculture. Now, this next group is a group that we have to be concerned about. This is, pardon me, this is a counterculture. They're against what the dominant culture stands for, what the organization stands for. They don't buy into any of this. And, if we could use an analogy from old political thing, a house divided against itself can't stand. Now, you could say, all right, well, counterculture is probably not that large, but those kinds of people spread hate and discontent, and an organization is not going to be successful if they don't have them. Now, notice here at the bottom of the slide that how people interact, subcultures and countercultures form, ethnic, etc. Japanese organizations, subcultures often form based on date of graduation from university or their gender, etc. So we think about all these things, and of course that's in Japan, and we think about what Europe is down here. There's some of those things, but these are subcultures. These are what they call important subcultures. But here we're talking about countercultures. And we really have to be very, very very, very cognizant of these, and make sure that they're not working against the fabric of the organization. If they are, it's recording disaster. Now, here are some issues that we have when we have subcultures and societal subgroups into the larger society. A subculture, remember, those people are okay at the beginning, at least, they can morph into a counterculture. Any firm may have extreme difficulty bringing even not necessarily a counterculture, a subculture into the overall fabric. One of the classic examples of that, I think, was given when Disney opened its European operation, Euro Disney. They opened it in France. I can't remember how many years ago. But one of the things that happened almost immediately there was that the folks who were working for Disney in France objected because the Disney folks wanted to get everybody together, and they wanted everybody to put on a T-shirt that looked alike. And so what the Americans were doing, or the Disney folks were doing, was promoting unity. The French thought it was something was taken out of a playbook that the Nazis developed, and they were adamantly against it. And so this was a question here of not understanding someone else's culture, and that it got rectified. So it didn't become a major problem, but certainly it could have become a problem. And then the last is, if you are embracing natural divisions, you're going to have a problem here. It's just not going to work. And notice it says here you're going to have problems operating internationally and globally. Now, this is something that we would think right off the bat, hey, this is great. This is what we want. We want the multicultural organization. But notice that what this says is, we say we value diversity, but we work very hard to block the transfer of society-based subcultures into the fabric of the organization. I can't give you a specific example of that that I've seen or that I've experienced, but it's something that we need to understand, that when it sounds good on the surface, but it's not something that we find has ever worked very well. So we have to be careful about that, even though it sounds like, hey, this is something we're doing and that's great. It's not. Now, let's look at steps to develop a multicultural organization the right way. You have to have pluralism, and it's exactly what it says. We have to integrate informal networks by eliminating barriers and then increasing participation. And by the same token, I would like to extend that to not only participation, but opportunity. We have to make sure that certain groups are not linked with certain jobs that identify them. Now, let me use, and I don't mean to sound something is bad here, but there was a time in some organizations that we linked Black people with janitorial work. That's not something we want to do. That doesn't mean to say that they can't do that. Doesn't mean to say that they shouldn't do that. Doesn't mean to say they can't be good at doing that. But we don't want to lump all people of one race or or people of one gender or one ethnic group into certain jobs. It happened in the United States, by the way, back in the 1800s or so. We saw a lot of Irish police officers. Saw a lot of Irish working in what we would consider the service industry, driving streetcars or eventually trolleys or things like that. One of the reasons they did was because in many cases they needed a job. In the second case, they could speak English. They would work for less. Is that a good thing to do? No, but I mean, we need to think about that. So we don't want to do that. And then eliminate interpersonal conflict, which is based upon identity of a certain group or certain a certain race, a certain nationality, etc. That's just not going to help. Get rid of that stuff. That builds walls, doesn't build bridges. Now this is what we see. This is figure 15.1. We can see this on at the bottom of page 353. These are common assumptions, shared values, observable culture. And that's what we're going to find. And notice here what the slide says down at the bottom. I think this is important to think about. The more we dig into this, the more difficult it is to discover the culture, but then the more important the aspect becomes. So let's move on from that. Here we have cultural symbols, and this is observable culture. What we see, we do that. Shared values speaks to the whole. You can see this is mentioned here, and if you will look at what Microsoft does at the top of page 354. Our employees profess a passion for technology. And then truth, the deepest and broadest layer. Sagas. We all know what they are. But in the organization, we're telling a story of some kind. It's heroic always. It's based on truth, but it's probably lost the 100% truth aspect. So it's a little bit mentioned. And I remember a saga that I can tell you was not particularly, except I was in the Army, and I was attending a school in the Army. Very, very, I won't say an important school. I like to think that it was, but importance is relative, I suppose. But anyway, we were facing a very difficult test, and they were called into the auditorium. There were 200 and some of us in this class, and so the speaker started reading a heroic account of a honest-to-goodness soldier who was a hero. Don't know the person's name, never heard it. Wounded and helped his comrades to safety and eradicated the number of the enemy, et cetera, and so on and so forth, and all the things that he did, so on and so forth. And this guy related this story to us, and he said, now you think about this soldier and what he went through, and all you have to do is take a test. Well, he kind of made a point there. And, you know, what we were going to do was certainly not going to be anywhere close to what this fellow had done in saving his comrades, himself, helping win a battle. Rights, we know what they are. There's things that we do on a routine basis. Notice it says it's standard activities that we do. The text gives you an example of what the Japanese do, especially in many of their smaller businesses. Let's say medium-sized to small, and some of the larger ones may do it as well. The business leadership and employees get together before the day starts, before the operational day starts. And they sing songs and do exercises and things of that nature, and that's supposed to promote a sense of belonging and camaraderie and so on and so forth. Of course, we need to remember one of the reasons that something like that works in Japan is because 97% of the people that live in Japan are ethnic Japanese. We don't have 90% ethnic anything in the United States. But it doesn't mean that they're right and we're wrong, or vice versa. This means that works for them, and it's something that they do on a routine basis. Cultural symbols. We can think of these as just that it identifies somebody. We look and we immediately associate that color, as is on the slide here, brown with UPS. We immediately associate Big Blue with IBM. And I always like to talk about back in the 1960s, you knew an IBM salesman when you saw him. Now, let me stop and tell you that in the 1960s, IBM sales force was, as far as I know, all men. I never did see a woman salesperson for IBM in those days. Anyway, you knew the IBM guy was around because he had on a blue suit, white shirt, and wore a red tie. You knew who it was, no problem. So that was a symbol. We associated that symbol, that dress, with the IBM guy. Shared values. This is a list outlining what constituencies, what constitutes a strong culture. It can be found, by the way, on page 357. Of course, it can backfire if it does not adapt. It's also a belief in what we do. But I want you to notice the last bullet here. A shared value can turn into a competitive advantage. And if we look at, I posted some time ago, and the shared values, the 5 operating principles of Mars Candy, and something that we can look back upon and say, well, yeah, that sets them apart. It gives them a competitive advantage in things that they are doing. Now, here are some shared values here. This goes along with what we just talked about. Notice what it says here first. It reinforces the identity that we're trying to put forward to the outside world. It helps us keep our commitment, and this commitment is a collective. So it's everybody is being committed here to the same thing. It promotes a stable social system within the organization. And finally, and I find this to be a little interesting, is that it reduces bureaucracy. I'm not sure that I agree with that, but it could. We're going to talk about bureaucracy a little bit later here in the course, and I always like to point out we should not always think of bureaucracy as being bad. We like to think of it as being bad. It was not. It was never set up to fall into that category. Now, this talks about characteristics of strong cultures. And I don't think that anything here is really something that we cannot understand or haven't adapted to. Notice it talks about the rites and rituals and ceremonies are important. They're not just things that are done to be doing them. You know, if you have a company picnic, they have a company picnic. That may all be all it is, but if you're having a company picnic to instill something or to continue to promote something, then it takes on a different meaning. We have a set of informal rules and expectations that we are supposed to follow. And it allows us to understand without this formality what it is we're supposed to do and what's expected of us. And it's finally a belief that what we do is important. Not only us, but our managers. If we don't have that belief that what we're doing is important, we probably need to do something different, go someplace else, because we're not being able to do what we're supposed to be doing. Organization myths. Well, they exist, but we can't really prove anything about them. Usually true, they're accepted, they help redefine some things, but excuse me, they're usually not true, but they're accepted. And they may be based on fact, but they have an awful lot of fiction that has cropped into this thing. And so then those are things that we have to be able to do. This helps managers redefine missions in such a way that people don't see them as impossible. That's what the guy was doing when he sat on the Foot Locker that morning in the auditorium in Fort Bliss, Texas, and told us, "Hey, you guys got it easy." By the way, it wasn't all guys; there were women in the class as well. But you got it easy. It helps us promote experimentation and allows managers to do what managers are supposed to do. Now this brings us to innovation. Innovation is either creating a new product, taking us to some place we have not been before with a product, and then a new idea, and then putting those things into practice or into production. This is the the innovation process of new product development. Notice we have to start off with an idea. We move it to experimentation. We move it to feasibility determination. And then it goes over to final product application. And of course, when all this goes around, we have to have organizational support. Now, every new product that comes out is not always widely accepted. A classic story that I like to tell is about the Post-it note. And a fellow by the name of Art Fried, he had a cohort, and I don't remember the cohort's name. And they were trying to develop an adhesive, and they worked for a 3M Minnesota Mining and Manufacturing Company. Minnesota Mining and Manufacturing Company has a long history of product innovation and promoting product innovation with its employees. They go so far as to allow an employee with a good idea to have a 2-year trial period, give him or her a budget and additional resources. If the product comes to fruition, great. If it doesn't come to fruition, nobody says anything about it. Thank you for what you tried to do, and go back where you were. Well, anyway, they were trying to come up with this adhesive, and it didn't work for what they were trying to make it work for. But Fry found that if he put it on some pieces on this paper, he sang in his church choir, and he could separate the pages in his hymnal. So he saw an application for it. And he sent a note to his bosses about it, and then they just shrugged him off. Said, we don't see any application for this. So then he decided to send his bosses notes with a Post-it note attached to it. Well, they thought it was a great thing to do, and so they decided, hey, we need to bring this product to put this idea into production and produce them. And so they did. And then they couldn't get any of their vendors to take them because they didn't see an application for them. So somebody else got creative in 3M, and they sent letters with Post-it notes stuck to them to the executive secretaries of Fortune 500 companies. And they immediately called their vendors and said, we want these Post-it notes. So that's a story of idea generation, but it still had to be taken a step further to get it to work, because even though it'd been proven, there weren't people who wanted to buy the product. We have either product innovations, which we've just talked about, or process innovations, which are new ways of doing things, and hopefully if we do them correctly, will create efficiency, save resources, and take us down to increasing our profit. Innovation, as it says here, is a continual process of both exploitation and exploration. Exploitation is simply the better use of resources, whereas exploration, I like to just say, is thinking outside the box. It's a what if. It's causing us to go beyond our comfort zone, to think of something new, think of something different, think of something that never was. I use a paraphrase of an old phrase that Robert Kennedy, late Senator Robert Kennedy, liked to use. And he, by the way, he's not the originator of this comment, and I'm not sure who is, but he said some people see things as they are and say why, and I think of things that never were and say why not. And that's what this is talking about down here at the bottom. Management philosophy is linking goals with the methods to achieve them. Simply that. We know that organizations have a mission statement, and then the mission statement is supported by goals and objectives. So we have to have a linkage here of goals and how we're going to get there. So it's a goal, and we have a roadmap to get to that goal. We've got to link the two together. So if we don't do that, then they're standing on either ends of the spectrum, looking at each other and figuring out how do we get together. And it's not necessarily an easy thing to do. Now here we're going to talk about what's known as a well-developed management philosophy. Notice the first thing it says, it establishes boundaries. And everybody knows what those are. You want to look at that as operational boundary. You can look at it any kind of boundary you want. People know where they are now. Obviously, you're going to say that there's some problem with this if we set up boundaries. But I like to look at this as being guidelines, not absolutes. We know we try to have some method, if you will, of approaching, evaluating, and implementing new ideas, and or how we're going to approach something that's new and unusual to us. And then finally, we want to keep people together within the organization by saying, if you follow this roadmap, it's going to lead us to what we want to achieve in the long run. So it's laying out what you want to say, it's laying out expectations. That's fine, but saying if you follow this, it's tried and true, we're going to be successful. Well, we need to talk here about managing organizational culture. And remember, we need to modify, if necessary, the visible aspects through our stories and our sagas and our rituals, etc. We should have some type of reward system. We talked about this way back in both chapter 4 for reinforcement, reinforcing behavior that we thought was good. We want to have some kind of reward. And we also talked about rewards in other parts of the text. And so notice there's two kinds here: steady state, hierarchical, evolutionary, and change market culture. So you have to be able to do both of those things. And then obviously we have to set the tone for the organization. What is it we expect? You know, this is what we do. Again, this is who we are. This is what we are. This is how we operate. This is who we are and who those people are. And it's not so much. I don't want to make this into a thing that sounds like it's us against them. It's not. I don't mean to say that, but it is the difference between who's inside and who's outside. Now, here are some things we really have to be careful about. This is changing the corporate culture and trying to change it from the top down. This just is not going to work. It won't work because if we're changing just the culture or what we're trying to do, but without changing how we operate, it's not going to work, because now we're sending a mixed message. So we don't want to do that. And the second thing is, an important thing for me, it's always to me, is when you're trying to implement something from up here and you're expecting the people down here to adapt to it, you've created a gulf here, because they don't always understand what you're trying to do. Why? So you ought to come down here and talk to these folks and say, this is what we're going to do. Tell us what you think about it. Get their ideas, get their buy-in. And be surprised that people who are doing the job know what they're doing. Organizational lag just simply says that this company is not staying abreast of the changes in the greater environment. And we have new things coming along. We're not staying abreast of them. This can be innovation. It could be new uses of technology. It could be any number of things. But this is really something that has to be thought about. It not only doesn't stay abreast, but won't stay abreast, and tends to rely on the old ways that got us here. That's really a problem with doing that, because if we say we have to follow the rules and we're not ready to adapt, that means we're probably very resistant to change. And any company that's resistant to change is probably on a short trip to non-success, and they'll get there very quickly. And then these are some techniques used to overcome cultural lag. We can show that demonstrating how our shared values, etc., can be applied to the new innovations that we want to bring in. We have to make sure that we do that. It's between what and who we are and new way of thinking. And then finally, and this is our last slide, we have to be able to balance changing the rules with rule following. Well, that brings us to the end of chapter 15. I will have this posted tomorrow and on the in with week 7 and with the PowerPoint slides, and you'll be able to find it there. So I know that there's no one who tuned in for this, because I didn't announce that I was doing this today. I hope that you'll be able to see this. I'll make notice of it again tomorrow, as I said. And then I do look forward to talking with you on Monday next week. And then I will be gone for a few days, and I'll be back, and I'll be back for the last session. So I thank you for your attention this evening and this afternoon. I hope we got through this and made it enjoyable for you. Thank you, and good night.